All right, y'all, you're locked on Falcons for an emergency pod. The Deion Jones trade finally happened. We'll be breaking down the compensation and the timeline and why this happened now.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew. Of course, we thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And perhaps this is your final listen of the day if you're checking us out Sunday night. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube, where we are airing live for this emergency pod. And we'll be talking all about the Deion Jones trade. It won't be a full episode, but we'll break down sort of the compensation of this trade that finally went down Sunday evening, a few hours after the Falcons lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Week 5. The Falcons are getting a 6th-round pick from the Cleveland Browns in the 2024 draft. So not next year's draft, but the draft after next. And the Browns are getting Deion Jones and a 7th-round pick from the Falcons in that same 2024 draft. And I'm sure many of you are sitting here thinking, like, the Falcons gave up Deion Jones for this? That's not enough. But if you are thinking that, well, welcome to Locked On Falcons, because you're probably new here, because we've been talking about this basically for months now, talking about essentially what the reasoning behind the Falcons moving on from Deion Jones was essentially a salary dump. And we'll get more into that later in the episode, but let's go to backtrack and look at the timeline that we've been discussing ad nauseum on this podcast for the last several months. You go back as recently to May, the timeline actually goes back to 2021 with the Falcons being open to the idea of shopping Deion Jones and not really getting the compensation that they wanted then. And now, you go back to May, and basically I did an episode back at like leading up to June 1st, basically saying I think Deion Jones has played his final snap in Atlanta for the Falcons. That technically was not true because he did play another couple of snaps in the preseason this past summer, but he did not wind up playing another regular season snap for the Falcons. Obviously, things got complicated with the Falcons' ability to move on from Deion Jones due to the offseason shoulder surgery that he had in early June. And then he was able to report the training camp, and all the reports were that no trade was imminent, but the Falcons were not going to just outright cut him at that point in time. And so he did work his way back from that shoulder surgery and play in the Falcons preseason finale. But essentially, he then went on IR again. Essentially, as I read it, that situation as basically a stay away so that the Falcons wouldn't have to deal with having to play him and, ruining his trade value and all that stuff. The Falcons were able to restructure his contract. And basically, now in October, we were waiting for him to come off of injured reserve. This past week was the first week where he would have been eligible to do so. My assumption is that the Browns will, once he passes a physical, wants to finalize his trade. If he passes a physical, then, he will come off injured reserve and immediately play for them. But I imagine he is healthy, given some of the other Falcons players that are ready to come off of injured reserve. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for several months now, you've heard my skepticism on the potential for a trade to develop, but that kind of changed after the Falcons decided to restructure his contract again before the regular season started this year, which was the 3rd time that they've restructured his contract since March of 2021. And that, to me, that restructure basically made it really much more likely that the Falcons could move him, because it was basically able to lower his base salary to roughly $1 million. And that basically meant that any team acquiring Deion Jones would only have to absorb that $1 million, basically a veteran minimum size contract from him. And before that restructure, one of the things I talked about was maybe there was like a half dozen teams that had enough cap space to trade for Deion Jones and absorb his contract. And then after that restructure, it basically became pretty much all the teams in the league that could now afford him, and that thus shot the odds up significantly, 75-80% increase in the odds that this thing would happen. And from that cap standpoint, talking about the money, as far as I understand, and again, I'm not an expert on this, guys, and so if I give you bad information here, I will correct it in the future. But as far as I understand, it's a cap neutral move for the Falcons, right? I know Tom Pelissero of NFL Network put out there that the Falcons will have to eat $12 million in dead money in 2023. I actually think that's $12 million in 2022. And so I think right now it's basically a cap neutral move. His Deion Jones's cap hit in 2022 before this trade was like $13 million. So the Falcons are still basically going to be on the hook for roughly $12 million, give or take a couple $100,000. And so, the one question I do have is, is this because it's after June 1st? Is this similar to how cuts are? And so you still have some dead money in 2023. And if that is the case, then it's maybe like $5 million, I think. Or does all that money come off the books because it's a trade and not a cap cut? I'm not 100% sure. But essentially, this move was not made to create cap space. The Falcons already did that with the restructure, saving about $7 million. And it's really just about getting a bad contract off the books. And that's really the why of this move. And we'll get into that as we continue today's episode coming up, and why exactly the Falcons were so eager to move on from Deion Jones and willing to basically accept pennies on the dollar to trade him. But the last thing I'll say about the money, according to overthecap.com, the Falcons now dead money in 2022 sits at about $77 million. They were already at the record, I think, was $65 million. So, this team is historic right now and just really making history now with the amount of dead money. And again, I think that's a big part of why the Falcons wanted to move on from Deion Jones. But we'll talk about that as we continue today's episode, guys. But I do want to tell you a little bit about our friends over at PrizePicks, who present a fun new way of playing daily fantasy. All you got to do is pick 2 to 5 players, and if they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projections. And the great thing is you're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections, and you can get projections on NFL, NBA, MLB, college football, golf, NHL, so much more. PrizePicks is safe, it's fast, it's easy. It's currently in operation in over 30 states in the US and Canada. All you have to do is download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up for their new fun way of playing daily fantasy. And first-time users will receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 if they use the promo code Locked On at sign up. That means if you deposit $100, you'll get $100 from PrizePicks to play with. Don't forget that promo code Locked On, LOCKEDON, at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. And guys, before we continue today's episode, I do want to tell you about my friends over at Built Bar, who present you the candy bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. Of course, it's easy for me to confuse the two because Built Bars are so delicious. They're in fact better than candy bars because they're not only taste good, they're good for you because they're low in calories, sugar, and carb, but high in protein, high in fiber. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, whether that's milk chocolate or white chocolate. You can get them in a variety of flavors. They have tried and trues like cookies and cream. I'm a big fan of the coconut almond. It tastes just like an Almond Joy. You got the peanut butter brownie, the salted caramel raspberry, coconut almond. They're always unveiling limited time flavors like each and every week. So head on over to built.com to find out what are these flavors. Order yourself a mix box to find your favorite if you want to try them all. Of course, you use the promo code LOCKEDON15 at checkout and you'll get 15% off your order. Just go to built.com and use that promo code LOCKEDON15, LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at built.com. So talking about why the Falcons traded Deion Jones, essentially it boils down to this regime didn't like him, right? That's how it's been termed to me. And regardless how you or I feel about Deion Jones, that's basically what it boiled down to. And whether you wanted to do as so many people did this offseason and, talk about Deion Jones's toughness and his leadership and his scheme fit and all these various things to essentially justify whether or not the team liked him or not, they just didn't want him. And I think money was a big part of it. We've seen this team move on from several big contracts since arriving in January of 2021. Basically, the only big contracts that they've been able to retain are players like Grady Jarrett, Jake Matthews. And I think there's a message in that those guys were the right guys. Again, whether you or I agree with that is is neither here nor there, but they felt that Grady Jarrett and Jake Matthews were the type of guys that deserved the big money, were the leaders and all that various things, captains on the current team, and guys like Deion Jones fit into that group with Julio Jones and Dante Fowler and Calvin Ridley that were well compensated by the previous regime, but this regime didn't want to remain in the business of paying those guys. Matt Ryan's in that group, although I don't think that was because Matt Ryan wasn't the right guy. Basically, just Matt Ryan wasn't good enough for the price that the Falcons were paying for him. And maybe you can, if you want to soften the blow, how you feel on Deion Jones, you can say basically he was overpaid and he wasn't good enough for the price tag, because we've seen Deion Jones struggle the last 2 years and especially this past year in the Dean Pease system. But basically what I've been saying since May, with the signing of Nick Kwiatkowski, to me, it was signaling that this regime was ready to move on, right? The fact that the Falcons worked out Will Compton, a free agent, last week on Tuesday, signaled that they were willing to move on from Deion Jones. If they were willing to embrace Deion Jones and welcome him back into the fold, why were the Falcons continuously bringing in new linebackers if you already had an asset in Deion Jones already on your roster? And again, that just sort of solidified the statements that myself and others have been making for several months now, that they didn't see Deion Jones as an asset. Now, I still think Deion Jones is capable of playing good football. It just, to me, it was never really in the cards that it was going to happen in Atlanta. Hopefully for Deion Jones' sakes and Browns fans' sakes, that continues in Cleveland. I know Cleveland's linebacker situation is messed up. You saw that last week with the hurting that the Falcons put on them. I think, Chris Lindstrom actually killed a guy, one of those linebackers. So they definitely needed some help at that position. And maybe they're a better football team today. I certainly think they're not a worse football team today with Deion Jones joining that group than they were before today. So we'll see if they're a significantly better team, and we'll find out if the Falcons are going to be better as a football team, particularly at that linebacker position moving forward. Time will tell on that issue. But to me, the thing that will be the most telling is the development of Troy Anderson. Right. And I think Troy Anderson, I mentioned this on last Wednesday's episode. I think he's off to a good start. He's impressed me based off of his play through 4 games. He's much further ahead of schedule than I thought he would be at this point in his career, given how raw he was coming out of Montana State. I think I mentioned on the Rapid Reaction Sunday evening that I thought Troy Anderson did some good work for the Falcons, filling in for Michael Walker late in the game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And so if Troy Anderson long-term, again, time will tell, if he lives up to this potential, but if he fulfills his potential, his ceiling as that sort of Fred Warner type of player, or maybe a poor man's Fred Warner, if you don't like those lofty expectations for what Troy Anderson has the potential to be, no one's going to care too much. If Anderson lives up to that, no one's going to care about Deion Jones and what the Falcons lost at this point in time. And so, I think that's kind of what I've been saying to folks that have been insistent that Deion Jones can still contribute to this team coming off of IR for these last couple of weeks. I feel like all the snaps that you potentially could have given Deion Jones moving forward were snaps that he was stealing away from Troy Anderson, who I think so far has shown that there is a promising future for him. And again, time will tell if he lives up to those expectations, but we'll just sort of have to see. And now the saga of Deion Jones and the trade is over. We can put it finally to bed. And so that's what I will do here. I will help put you guys to bed on this Sunday evening with this emergency pod. So that's it. We'll potentially talk about it tomorrow if I can get a certain guest on tomorrow. Jeff Schultz of The Athletic, who's been, at the forefront of the Deion Jones, the will they, won't they. He'll also probably be joining us to talk about the Week 5 game against the Bucs as well. So that is potentially on deck for tomorrow. Again, we know that the Falcons are, creating cap space, moving on, opening up the doors for, potential big offseason in 2023. And so this move continues that line. If you guys have thoughts on this, by all means, leave a comment, hit me up, on social media at Locked On Falcons or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. Send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Jump in the Discord, Locked On Falcons. There's a link in the description below if you want to share your thoughts on this Deion Jones trade. But we'll be back for more coverage of this Falcons team, this trade potentially, as we move forward this week on Locked On Falcons. But guys, really appreciate it. Till then.